Alleluia, 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 Alleluia. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Jesus left the district of Tyre and went by way of Sidon to the Sea of Galilee, into the district of the Decapolis. People brought to him a deaf man who had a speech impediment, and begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him off by himself away from the crowd, put his finger to the man's ears, and spitting touched his tongue. Then he looked up to heaven and groaned and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And immediately the man's ears were opened, his speech impediment was removed, and he spoke plainly. He ordered them not to tell anyone, but the more he ordered them not to, the more they proclaimed it. They were exceedingly astonished, and they said, He has done all things well. He makes the deaf hear, and the mute speak. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
I apologize for everybody who's expecting to come and see a red vestment and a red chalice veil for St. Valentine. St. Valentine, he doesn't have an official feast day on the liturgical calendar, so as you know, there are thousands of saints who all have their own feast day, but there are only certain saints who we celebrate in the liturgical calendar. So St. Valentine is one of the most famous saints that does not typically get celebrated. Another one is St. Joan of Arc. St. Joan of Arc, one of the most famous saints, she doesn't have a liturgical feast day. So instead, the church asks us today to celebrate the memorials of Saints Cyril and Methodius. Basically the two evangelists who evangelized the Slavic peoples in the early Middle Ages. So we can celebrate them as well today. But regardless, happy Valentine's Day to everybody. Also, we get to hear this morning, this afternoon, we get to hear from this continuing story from the book of Genesis. We've been getting to go through the book of Genesis here all week. We talked about the creation story at the beginning, and the creation of man and woman, and now we find the great trial and temptation that took place, the beginning of the fall, right, of Adam and Eve. And there's certain details, right, that many of us are familiar with, and then there's other details that are maybe not as familiar. Right? One of the most important details that really changes the idea of the story is about the serpent himself. Many of us, we have this image in our head, right, of kind of like a harmless little, garter snake or something like that. Right? In Hebrew, the Hebrew language is very simple. Right? It's one of the primitive languages of world history. So because of that, the vocabulary is not terribly developed. So with that being said, right, there are many words in Hebrew that can be translated in lots of different ways. And so this word for serpent is the Hebrew word nahash. It literally means like the burning ones. But it can be translated in many different ways and is often translated in different ways throughout the scriptures. Like, for example, the great sea beast, the Leviathan, in the book of Job. It's that same word, the nahash. And so it can apply to a simple serpent or a snake, but it can also apply to things that are much more grandiose. In the book of Revelation, right, the great dragon of the book of Revelation is called the ancient serpent. So it's making this equation between a dragon sort of creature and a serpent. So most likely what was taking place here in the garden, it was not simply that the serpent was tricking Adam and Eve. There was a trial taking place primarily for Adam and Eve both, but most importantly, for Adam. Because as we recall, in the story of Genesis, Adam had two jobs in the garden. He was to guard and to protect the garden. And he wasn't just supposed to protect the garden because it was his territory, because it was the place that God had given him. He was supposed to protect the garden because there was the woman, his bride. In Genesis, when it talks about how God built up Eve from the side of Adam, it's the same word that's used to describe when the Israelites later on, when they built up the temple. It's the same Hebrew word. So the book of Genesis is showing that, in a certain sense, the Garden of Eden was like a sanctuary for God's temple, the temple of humanity, right? And especially the crowning of all creation, right? As the first woman. And so she's the temple. And then this comes up later on in the Old Testament when the priests likewise were given the same command that Adam was given about the temple. They were told that their job was to guard and protect the temple in Jerusalem. So it's not simply that the serpent has tricked them. Right? The serpent has gone where he is not allowed to be. And Adam was the guardian and the protector. Most likely when the serpent said, surely you will not die if you eat of the fruit of the tree, it was likely a threat. And again, in Hebrew, because the language is so simple, sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to translate exactly the sense. But so what Adam should have done is protected the garden and protected his bride and gone to battle with this ancient serpent, this Nahash, and he did not. But again, I also think it's significant, right? Not only that he should have done it for love of his bride, but we also need to think about this in terms of the church as well. It was very clear in the book of Genesis that, as I've been talking about, I've only been scratching the surface. There's lots of other details, right, when you're studying it in its original language. It's a very big deal that the garden was a sanctuary. It was a holy place. It was holy ground, sacred, deserving of honor and protection. And I think in a similar way, you and I, we have the same kind of call that Adam did, right, these days with the church, right? With how many people want to speak disrespectfully of the church, who is Christ's bride. Out of love for his bride, Christ laid down his life for the church. And you and I, sometimes we can be far too disrespectful or profane when we speak about the church, the beauty of the church's teachings. We also, all of us are familiar that in the church, there's discussions and there's disagreements about how the Mass and the liturgy should be celebrated. And again, the same idea applies. Sadly, in many places in the church, the distinction has disappeared. But the sanctuary is supposed to be just that, holy ground, sacred space, deserving of honor and protection. Same thing with the Blessed Sacrament, the holiest of objects, the most sacred of things, is deserving of honor and respect. And I would suggest that over the last 100 years, the last 60 years in the church, many of us have forgotten that. The utter sacredness of the Eucharist, the sacredness of the liturgy, the sacredness of the sanctuary. Some of you who are old enough to remember, maybe you were an altar server, back in the day, right? Remember, sometimes altar servers, when they would get trained, they would place their hand on the altar, right? And they would get rebuked and scolded, maybe even worse. Again, remembering the sacred. This underlining message of the book of Genesis is not just the defilement of Adam's home and of his bride, but the defilement of the sanctuary. And all of us should let that enter into our mentality and our spiritual thinking about how we think about the church, how we think about the Mass. It's sacred ground to be protected and honored.